Hey everyone, and welcome to the Jam Yearbook. I'm Jim.
And I'm Matt. Feels like it's been a long time since we've done this album anniversary stuff, Jim.
Uh-huh.
I mean, coming through November, December, and now the beginning of the year. The beginning and the ends of years tend to be a little weak, and maybe we're just a little lazy. Or me personally, I'm snowed in and cold. So, but we're ready to jump back in, and we hope everyone enjoyed our trek into emo last time.
Yeah, we're done dwelling on the sadness there, and it's time for some anniversaries from January and February. Before we reveal the poll winners, though, there were some debuts that were worth mentioning.
Yeah, we'll start out with Primus and Frizzle Fry. I have an exception to a rule, Jim. Primus can have as many songs as they want on an album. They never get boring. Primus is like Rush with brain damage. They sound absolutely insane.
That's a great comparison. And yeah, Frizzle Fry is so good. The first three Primus albums are favorites of mine, and this probably has two of my top five favorite songs by them. John the Fisherman hits and grooves so well at the same time, and Toys Go Winding Down speaks to my inner bass nerd. Well, everything he plays does. Les Claypool is just amazing.
Yeah.
On Toys Go Winding Down, the relentless triplets he's playing just make my head spin. The precision of it is insane.
Everything this band does makes my head spin. It's
Yeah,
friggin'
definitely.
amazing. And then there was Blink 182's debut with Cheshire Cat.
I didn't even know this existed. I'd never listened to it before. I'd always assumed Dude Ranch was their first album because that's what you hear. But I got to admit, I liked it quite a lot. It's kind of a sloppier version of the mid 90s punk that we heard on alternative radio,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, it was.
Sponge or Rancid. And I'm kind of surprised at how decent the musicianship is on it as well. It's not a case of became better musicians. This is really good. And there's a song called Benoit Balls. It's
Yeah.
awesome. Just go
Yeah,
listen
it
to it.
is.
It's fun.
It is. It is. And the humor that they put in their songs is one of their endearing traits with me. I may not like everything they do, but hey, I'm up for some sophomoric humor
Yeah.
all the time. And then Whitney Houston's debut.
Yeah. Just named Whitney Houston. This is a massive album in its time. It kind of slow burned. It came out, in 1985, which is the year we're covering, but it really didn't become a massive album until 1986 or late 1985. But full admission, Matt, I know all the words to The Greatest Love of All.
That's not a surprise.
And I owned the 45 single of How Will I Know. I remember making
Oh,
the mixtape and being on the eighth grade field trip to the State House. Remember that from
I
junior
do
high?
remember that. Holy crap. Yeah.
And I brought my little boom box, and How Will I Know was one of the songs that I recorded to a cassette tape and had with me. And I got to sit in the back of the bus with all the girls with this cassette tape and my boom
Oh,
box. Yeah, but come on, this is Whitney, and
yeah, it is.
I didn't stay a fan forever in life, but she's incomparable. She's someone who you can just call by her first name, like Dolly, Kenny, Shania, Whitney,
Hmm.
and people know who you're talking about.
Yep. Still has the signature version of the American National Anthem.
Absolutely.
Yep. So, Jim, I really wish I would have waited to learn where this was in the poll because I thought this was going to be a winner and I went and listened to it. Um, so yeah, her voice is amazing, right? But for me, the 80s and 90s were just not stellar years for R&B. I kept tapping out, moving on, coming back, tapping out, moving on. So, but I knew I wasn't going to give this album a fair shake, but I fought through it. I just think it's not bad. It's just too pretty for me,
Yeah.
where especially where I was when this album came out, and
Hmm.
and I still kind of discriminated against it in that way because I still had that feeling. But if these were recorded in more of like a 70s sensibility, like Al Green or Rufus, because I can hear Whitney singing all those Shaka Khan songs, I probably would have appreciated it more.
Well, let's get on with the albums that actually were voted by the audience to be on the show this month or 2 months of January,
Yeah.
February.
Our first poll winner is Phil Collins, No Jacket Required. Jim, what
Yeah.
say you?
Yeah. I know we give Phil a hard time on this show. And this album hasn't really aged well for me. And don't get me wrong, I understand why it got its votes. It was huge when it came out, and I loved it. I listened to it, owned it. It was fantastic to me when I was 13 in 1985. 12 million copies of this album sold. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year. So maybe I just wore it out going back and listening to it. I thought I was going to really look forward to it for the show, but I think songs like Sussudio and Billy Don't Lose My Number are more fun when they come on spontaneously and I have the chance to be nostalgic.
Yeah, forced listen wasn't probably the best way to go about it. When I put it on myself, man, this album rocks. Right? I love it. He ruled. Phil Collins absolutely ruled the 80s. He was everywhere. Debuts, soundtracks, his own solo stuff, Genesis. He was everywhere. So going in, I thought I was going to be on repeat for a couple hours because I really like you. I really dug this. But again, I kind of tapped out, had to come back to finish it. But even then, I was kind of looking at my phone going, "Oh, is it over yet?" It was a victim of Whitney Houston, to be quite honest, because I turned to Phil to get me out of that mode, and it worked until Long, Long Way to Go came on, which is weird because I remember really liking that song, but I was just in maybe I needed some punk music or something to rip me out of the Whitney Houston frame of mind. It just wasn't fitting my mood. So I moved on, came back later, but it's still when I was finally in a good clear headspace, I still dug this album.
Yeah, it was not good required listening for me either. I will say, though, that I really enjoyed listening to One More Night again. It is the timeless song off that album, but most of the album after that is just stuck in the 80s. And the album is a lot of nonsense. I did some deep diving on it, and he admitted that the word studio was just a word he made up before he was leaving the studio one night as a marker to remember the melody and an idea that he had for the lyrics. So he just made up this word studio and went home thinking he was going to come up with what he wanted to use overnight and come back and lay down the track the next day. But when he came back, he hadn't thought of anything else, so he just used the studio. It means nothing. It's not a real word. And then you have Billy Don't Lose My Number. And I remember watching this video and hearing the song when I was a kid and trying to think, what's this story about? What's going on
Oh
here?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's some kind of person, they're on the run, and maybe they're kind of a folk hero status. But nope, the
Yeah.
song is meaningless. I read an interview with Phil where he just said that he just wrote the lyrics down and they just fit into the song, but they didn't have any meaning. He had no story. They were just kind of thrown together. It's a
But
word jumble.
and that's what's great because now, like what you did, what I did, probably what everybody else did, they made up their own narrative as to what this song is about. Right. And
Yeah.
that's what's good about art because music is art. You can interpret it.
So Phil Collins gave us a choose your own adventure song.
He did, but I
Okay.
kept skipping to the last song. No. But Billy, that was the song that turned this album around for me. Maybe because I put on the vinyl and that's how side two starts. So it could be its own thing separate from the first half. It really took on a new life and it really turned my opinion around. Who Said I Would has a bit of Prince sound in the chorus, so it gets points for me there, big time. Inside Out, Take Me Home, side two really saved the day. I wasn't so tired of Susudio after that. And one of the things that always kind of bugged me with Susudio is it's really hard to believe, it's probably jealousy. It's hard to believe there's humans playing those horns. They're impossibly fast.
I went and checked the credits because I was going to come on this show and call them out for being done on a keyboard. And I know they sound real, but I just thought for sure this precision, the speed, it just is too perfect.
It is perfect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The notes they hit is the embouchure of those trumpet players. So it was I think it's the Phoenix horns. They used to be the Earth, Wind, and Fire horns. And they are just
Ah.
freaking amazing.
Yeah, well, they've
The
got something
talent.
supernatural going on.
Yeah, they definitely do.
Okay, so album number two, I was quite happy this one came to the poll. Actually, I liked it a lot when I was younger. And it is Tears for Fears songs from the big chair. Going back to the album, yeah, it has all the hits, but the song that stood out for me was Mother's Talk. It's nice doing this show because you find songs on these albums that you liked when you were younger, and for some reason they just left your ether, your world. There's no longer existing there, and then you go back and you're like, wait a minute, I liked this song when I was a
Yeah,
kid.
this needs to go on my big playlist.
Yeah.
It's got to be there, right? It's a happy accident you chose Tears for Fears next because I had a trifecta going on with Whitney, Phil, and Tears for Fears. When they all seem to reach this moment, and I still blame Whitney. I mean, beautiful voice, but I still blame that album for just putting me in this anti-pretty frame of mind where whenever a song reached that point, I was like, nope, something else. I needed more space between downer songs. That's all. The Working
Gotcha.
Hour, the second song, is where I'm like, oh, come on. Why can't I get out of this mode? Stop. Because it puts a negative feeling in my brain about the song, and it doesn't deserve to be because it's a really good song. I usually try to group albums by genre a year, thinking I can avoid issues, but it really worked against me this time. I couldn't wait to listen to Primus. I dove right into that. And then these three just couldn't match that energy. Hey, I got through them. I just had to keep getting through the mental roadblocks, just realizing it wasn't the right time to be listening to these albums.
That can happen. And now I realize why you want more Primus songs on Frizzle Fry.
Oh, goddamn. Yeah, that was good.
What is interesting about Tears for Fears, because I hadn't realized this maybe when I was younger, and even though we had cassette tapes, that a lot of the album's instrumental outside of the hit songs we all know.
Yeah, is this kind of like pop prog or something?
Maybe. Yeah,
Because
maybe.
there's not many songs on this album, and they're, fairly long shouts, even over 5 minutes. I'm sure the radio edits shorter.
Two and a
Um,
half of that's just the end of them
oh no,
singing.
kidding! The ending of Shout just goes on and on. I love the chorus. Everybody loves the chorus. It's a participatory chorus. People love singing it, but 4 minutes of it, yeah, probably two of them aren't necessary at the end of the song. The Working Hours, it's 2 minutes in before Roland starts singing,
Hmm.
right? Motherstock, I agree, great song, but it feels like they went straight to the extended remix version instead of putting on a more condensed version on the album. It's like, no, we don't need remixes. This is just what the song is, which, hey, all respect. If that's the vision you have for the song, stick to your guns and put out what you believe in. I believe was the other tap out, and Broken kind of feels like space filler because they kind of put in their own little samples here and there. Maybe it was what they recorded when they were coming up with ideas for the song and they kind of mashed it up.
I think you should have hopped some decades while you were listening to these albums instead of trying to
Maybe,
listen to
maybe
all the
you're right.
1980s at the same time, because I think the album makes a perfect use of those 80s synth sounds like no other album did in that time. From the big key punches to the program beats and the electronic drums, something about that was actually produced better than a lot of the music that I've heard come out of the 80s. And then behind all of that, or really kind of, I would say, what was propping it all up were the real rhythm guitars and bass guitars that were still shining through those songs.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be all negative. And you bring up a good point. I have tried different ways to structure my listening. And maybe you're right. Maybe when I reach something from a certain decade, I'm like, maybe I need to just time travel a little bit. Go to the future, go to the past, something to get me up. But there are some bands that all I need are the hits and the occasional side piece. Tears for Fears may be one of them. And people, hey, this is a big moment for me. As Jim will attest, I am a completionist, and that being an album guy means I'm typically an all or nothing person. I own every Kiss album, and half of those don't need to be owned by anybody on in any situation. But because I love so many Kiss songs immensely, I forgive them for the crap. I just need to extend that thinking to to all bands. The hits off this album are great songs, and Kurt's bass playing, especially on Head Over Heels, kicks ass. It's really underrated.
It is.
So let's get out of the 80s then. Let's pop to a different decade. I think this was in the 70s, right? Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet.
1980.
It is night. Well,
Yep.
he's kind of stuck in the 70s.
Oh,
Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Bands, Against the Wind. Another big surprise poll winner for me.
the song Horizontal Bop on this is pretty cringe.
You're not joking. And that leads off the album too. That's a poor choice. And I think I texted you this too. I got like halfway through, like probably on the second chorus, and I'm like, this chorus reminds me of Brian Adams' Kids Want to Rock.
Yeah.
And
At,
I'm
like,
like, oh, of all the songs to rip on, Jesus.
how do you decide to lead the album with Horizontal Bop? You
Mm,
have like You'll Accompany Me next, which is a classic Seeger song to his fans.
yeah, no idea. Very bad decision. That's a song you play as a joke and live only. You know, the style itself is corny AF. I'm gonna, I'm trying not to swear, folks. Maybe John Valby was in the studio and they were just screwing around a little bit. It's not that it's in bad taste. It's just an awful song. You'll accompany me though. I dig that song, and I thought I was going to have a tap out moment with it. 'Cause I'm like, oh, I've heard that too much, but man, that song really hits. It's a really good song. By the way, putting an apostrophe instead of the letter A doesn't save space in the title of this song. Just something that kind of hit me as peculiar. It just makes me swear at the keyboard when I'm trying to type it, and my
Yeah.
search comes up with nothing because it's misspelled on the album.
Yeah, it bothered me too because there's no reason why they didn't just put like a company and just spell it the right way. He doesn't sing it like it sounds any different. But you're right. It's a cool song. There's something about Bob Seger songs when they're good Bob Seger songs, there's a warmth to them. Like a good Bob Seger
Yeah.
song is like a warm bowl of soup on a rainy, cold day. And
Yeah,
this
that hot
song,
cup of coffee.
yeah, it just fits that. And but Seeger can rock. We know he can. I'd forgotten about her strut. And I think I had this
Mm.
false memory. Her strut's a cool song, but
Yeah,
I
it is.
I had this false memory that it was a Don Henley song.
Really.
Yeah.
I guess I can it kind of feels like a song that the Eagles would try to do when they could were trying to prove that they were a rock band.
Or maybe Don Henley solo after the Eagles were
Yeah.
finished. I think it kind of fit that for me.
Yep. I don't know if I'd call any Seeger song a banger, but I must have been in the mood for what he was laying down. I because I dug most of this record. Just take off Horizontal Bop and it's really good. Betty Lou's getting out tonight. It kind of sounds like they're doing a bad copy of Eddie and the Cruisers. Betty Lou got a new pair of shoes, even though this was out way before Eddie and the Cruisers, and that's just based on a movie. It sounds like this was recorded at the same time as Horizontal Bop. It's just bad, corny songs. Take those
Hmm.
two out, you still got eight and, and an immensely better album. There's some lesser known gems on here. Fire Lake,
Yep.
Long Twin Silver Line, No Man's Land, really good, borderline great songs. Dragged down by two. Take those two out, and my opinion of them might go up a notch.
Well, you're also missing Shining Brightly. And I thought
Oh
that kind of
yeah.
sounded like a Van Morrison song. It even has a sax solo in it that's very Morrison-esque. So I didn't mind that. And it's not knocking Seeger to say he was writing like a Morrison song there. It's just the kind of writing he fell into when it wasn't a memorable radio hit, but it was still good.
Yeah, I think Seeger, when he tries to rock, it tends to come off a little more corny.
Yeah, I can relate.
Um,
That was me. That was me back in the
yeah,
day.
and there's nothing wrong with that because there are songs, not on this album, like a rock, that they're just mellower songs. But I think that's where for me, that's where his sweet spot is.
It is.
That's where I feel like I'm getting an honest Bob Seger. Yeah, this is what you're good at.
His only big, real, rock song was Old Time Rock and Roll.
And that's corny as hell too.
We don't even have it in our notes and we're not talking about it. Against the Wind is on this album. And I talk about
Yeah.
that
Oh
warm,
yeah.
warm bowl of soup on a cold day. Against the Wind is one of those songs that can just lead you into nostalgiaville when you listen to it. But I think I sent you a message that said, whenever I hear Against the Wind now, all I can think of is Forrest Gump running across
Oh.
America.
No, I don't know if I quite get that imagery, but I definitely see how you would.
Well, that's
And
the
I
song
think,
that plays when he's doing
yeah,
the trek across
yeah.
America.
But I think that you just kind of prove my point that, man, those songs, that's where his strength lies.
There's a nice mid-tempo in his songwriting on those
Yeah.
types of songs,
Yeah.
and he's not trying to rock, and it's not a ballad. It's a great mid-tempo song, and the piano playing stands out on a lot of those songs.
Yes, they do.
Yeah,
Yep.
so
It's just that when he tries to rock out, it sounds like he's doing karaoke,
it does.
right? Who hasn't done karaoke to old time rock and roll, right? Come on,
it's
Jim.
it's
Admit
another one.
it. Admit it. No.
Yeah, it's another one of those songs. We talk about songs that every band we ever played in with a cover band.
Yeah, it's one of
Oh,
those things you start out with. Smoke on the Water, old time
yep,
rock and roll. Come on,
yep.
it's all there. So let's do a really big shift here. Sorry, I'm gonna just hard stop on Bob Seger there. So the Pretenders, this is another important debut for me, at least. I don't know where it sits with everybody else, but it's a poll winner, so it must be, it must hit with other people.
Yep.
This was the biggest poll winner surprise for me. I really thought we were going to be talking about Rush today, Jim. So first off, thank you for all the Pretenders votes. I love this album, and I've never gotten to geek out about Chrissy Hine on the show before. She is a very, very interesting person. So she was born in Akron, Ohio, attended Kent State as an art student. She was at the Kent State Massacre. She
Wow.
was in a band with Mark Mothersbaugh of Devo, the lead guy of Devo. I was called Sat Sun Matt.
Okay.
Then she moved to London. She worked for Enemy Magazine and Sex, the clothing store owned by Malcolm McLaren's wife. You know, Malcolm McLaren, who started the Sex Pistols.
Mm-hmm.
Moved to Paris, back to the US, back to France, back to France. She moved to Paris, then back to the US, back to France, then London. Failed attempts at marrying Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious for a work permit. There's got to be better ways, Chrissy.
Yeah.
you know, Trying to start a band with Mick Jones of The Clash and a band that would eventually become The Damned.
Wow.
She is immensely interesting. She was determined, so determined to make it in the music world. She wrote, made demos, and finally put together the original Pretenders lineup. The name The Pretenders was inspired by the Sam Cooke version of the Platter Sit, The Great Pretender.
That's an awesome bio.
She is awesome.
Yeah, thank you for the geek out. And I know the band's changed lineup over the years.
Yeah, but with this lineup, Martin Chamber, Pete Farndon, and James Honeyman Scott, they recorded a demo and gave it to Nick Lowe, who, of course, Chrissy Hine just happened to be friends with friggin' Nick Lowe. He produced an early single that ended up on their debut, Stop Your Sobbing. It always kind of reminded me of Dusty Springfield's I Only Want to Be With You. But the hit, the hit on this album, maybe it's got to be number one or two that the Pretenders are known for, is Brass and Pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And this song it's very different from just about every other song on the album. Precious, great song and a great choice to lead off the album. It hints at her punk influence, and the album does take on a different tone, starting with Stop Your Sobbing. Kid, it's got an almost 50s vibe. That guitar intro is really awesome. Private Life takes down the energy, which is good. It's a great lead into Brass. And then Lovers of Today, it kind of keeps it subdued until the final track, Mystery Achievement, which comes back strong and gives this album a last jolt of energy. Love this album.
This week's the first time I ever listened to this album completely from beginning to end. I'm very thankful. It was a surprise that it was a poll winner, but I probably wouldn't have been a completist if it had not been. So very happy with that. And yeah, Brass and Pocket, it really stands out apart as a hit, from other songs on the album. The other ones are all really good, as you've just said. But this song is the one that I know from the radio that I loved as a kid. And when they would come on, and like when it comes to the Pretenders, I've always respected them, but I have to admit, I was a casual fan. So the rest of the album really kind of surprised me. And I was almost at times trying to decide like what kind of rock genre it fit into. But
Yeah.
you're spot on. There's a lot of early 80s rock that crossed between punk with 50s vibes. And this is an album that gets better as it goes. So if the first song doesn't grab you, Precious, good song, but leave it on. Chrissy Hines, she's a great songwriter, and it's all right here in the debut album.
Yep. And I understand that the Pretenders, like album wise, yeah, they're probably not for everybody. But if you stick with it, their albums really kind of take you on a journey.
Mm-hmm.
Just some of the songs aren't as accessible as Brass and Pocket. That's all. And Chrissy Hine, she's on my Mount Rushmore of women in rock. Even the new stuff the Pretenders put out, it's worth a listen. It's not obviously what you're gonna get here, but it's still a good listen.
Well, moving us along, and speaking of Mount Rushmores of rock, period, we
Shit.
are
Yeah.
going to talk about Led Zeppelin and physical graffiti. We have not had many opportunities to talk about Zeppelin on the show, and I'm glad the audience voted for this one. What's tough for me is that this is not one of my favorite Led Zeppelin albums that I'd be excited to gush over. I can't imagine how many times in my life that I've listened to the first four Zeppelin albums. I've had a love affair with them in my life, but I have to ask, was this album the one that began their downward slide? And I do think there are good songs on it, but they're not really all classics for me. The one exception might be Trampled Underfoot because I'm a big John Paul Jones fan, and the clavinet in the song is just so cool and funky, and Jimmy Page's guitar is layered over it to like sonic perfection. But I have to admit, I struggle with Kashmir. And I know, like Zepp
Ooh,
purists, they're
Jim's
gonna
in
hate me for that.
trouble.
This is one of their most played live songs after this came out on the album. And even when Page and Plant reunited, they always play Kashmir. It always comes up. But there's something about that riff over and over again that just grates me. And
Mm.
it's not as spectacular to me as much as people love it. There's a lot of other great Zeppelin music. And I just kind of feel like this was a hodgepodge affair for them to make this album.
You're not wrong, and hate mail can be directed to Jim, not me this time, because hating on Kashmir, those might be fighting words to folks, certain folks. Uh, we might be on a familiar footing with Led Zeppelin. I think we share a lot of similar opinions. I respect what they mean in the history of music. I got on this album right away after my 80s friggin' mishap with Whitney, Phil, and Tears for Fears. It was a good reset.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I'd ever really listened to this album from beginning to end. And I have a really, and I think you share this too, a bias against double albums. They're typically not for me. Led Zepp fans must have been completely stoked though for this much music from them. Um, Growing up for me personally, four was the only cassette I owned, the one I knew the best. We can have an outside the box dual anniversary because my more intimate knowledge from this kind of an album came from the box set that came out in 1990. So, hey, we can celebrate that too. And that box set was incredible, but it gave an incomplete and disjointed feel of their albums. And,
Mm-hmm.
growing older, I became more aware of their evolution. The first album's bluesy, hard rock. The second, while still bluesy, incorporated some early examples of heavy metal as a blueprint. I wouldn't quite call it a heavy metal album, but it did provide a blueprint for some to follow in their footsteps.
Yep.
Three was it had a lot of acoustic tendencies, and four blended everything they did up to that point in perfectly to me. Houses of the Holy saw them get pretty experimental, and physical graffiti took all that blending that went on earlier, but then they put that experimental focus into there. And I often wonder if maybe physical graffiti wasn't them searching through older songs that they had recorded to see what they could do with now that they
Mm.
had more experience and could explore more in the studio. And that exploration kind of gave us like Custard Pie. And as you mentioned, Trampled Underfoot, Boogie with Stew. Those are very different songs for Led Zeppelin. Down by the Seaside, it's probably the least Led Zeppelin sounding song ever. I kind of got like country or Neil Young vibes from it.
But something that you just said about them leaning on some of the older albums to get these sounds, there are like four, five, six, maybe five at least songs on this album that were recorded during sessions for those earlier albums. They weren't re-recorded. They didn't revisit them. They were recorded then. And you have the song Houses of the Holy
I don't get
on
that.
this album. Oh, I bet you in the day it was cool. Oh, you bet somebody was like, they put a song Houses of the Holy
Yeah.
on this. Well, they
No,
were
it's annoying.
They recorded that for Houses of the Holy, but it was not good enough for the album. And they
Yep.
just kept that name and named the album Houses of the Holy. And then when they went to make this album and they were looking to fill a side of a record, they said, let's go get these songs we already recorded.
And I had wondered that if that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
And I got no problem with that. Maybe the songs didn't fit what they were doing at the time. And I'm sure, say a song like Custard Pie, right? Maybe they were working on something like that around Led Zeppelin 3. And for whatever reason, it just didn't work out. They got more experience and it became, the original version of what Custard Pie was. And it's just an example. I don't know. I'm kind of talking out my rear here. It could have been completely different to what it ended up to on
It,
Physical
it
Graffiti.
didn't though. It didn't though. I deep dived this. All of these songs that were recorded that were outside of new songs for Physical Graffiti were recorded at the time they were making the original albums. They did not
Oh,
re-record them for
yes, no, no.
Physical Graffiti.
They didn't re-record them.
No. So they just took old tracks that weren't good enough for their other albums,
Oh, okay.
but for some reason they wound up being good enough for Physical Graffiti. And that's why I think it's
Um,
kind of a downward slide.
yeah, because why would you do a double album of reject songs?
Exactly. I've been in bands where we had 15 songs and we're going to make an 11 song album and we had to cut 4 or 5 of those songs. I really, when we started working on the next album afterwards, we didn't go back to those other 4 or 5 songs. They didn't make the cut. They weren't good enough to be on the first album. So we didn't think, oh, wait a minute, let's just pick up these 4 songs and move ahead with these. We've got half an album written already. No, they weren't good enough to release. And then 2, 3 years later, maybe even 4 for some of these, you're like, oh, we've got a recording of this song and we have 3 sides to an album, but we need a 4th side. So let's just go get this. And that is what I researched and that is what happened. They just
Oh, you
went,
were there. You were there in the studio, Jim.
look, I
Just
can
giving you
I
shit.
can
I'm
read
just
Wiki,
giving you shit.
look, I can read Wikipedia. I'm sorry.
Not as good as I can, my friend. and you bring up a good point in this because there's a lot of different sounds on this album. One of the things that kind of was a little off-putting with this is Jimmy Page had a lot of different guitar sounds on this album.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of disjointing
Mm-hmm.
because when you change songs, your sound on songs or styles, it's kind of jarring. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't flow, and some of those songs, it's like, I don't even, it's not even a sequencing problem. It's how are you going to put this song in the album when there's no other song that sounds like it to kind of lead into it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Ultimately, though, Physical Graffiti for me, it's songs that are really good, but to me, this is what their 4 or 5, this is their 6th album. So it's not, I wouldn't even call it classic, air quotes, Led Zeppelin. Anything probably past 4 is like new Led Zeppelin. And Jim, you know me, I like my deep cuts.
Yeah, you do. All
So,
right.
hey, this album didn't need to be a double album. There's probably like 6 songs I'd cut
Yeah, you could cut this down to a good full-length album, and I'd have no problem with that.
and have another album left over.
Of songs that you recorded 7 years ago.
Exactly. And you could get lazy and not do anything.
They could have just saved those as unreleased songs for this box set you bought in 1990, and it
Yeah,
would
but
have
they
been
had no
great.
yeah, but they had no vision of that
Ah,
back in the 70s.
no, they
They had no
didn't.
vision of that. But you're right.
I am. I am. I am right. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to our personal picks for the month. And it was not hard for me to choose my pick for the month once everything was finished from the poll because the Black Crows Shake Your Moneymaker did get probably just 1 vote shy of being able to make the show. I
Yeah.
I didn't put my personal vote in, so I took it right now to be my choice when it didn't get the audience vote. I owned this album, Shake Your Moneymaker, back in the day, and I listened to it quite a bit. I didn't know how I was going to react to listening to it. Again, revisiting it. I actually think it's better now than it was in 1990. I think I can appreciate a little bit more as I'm older and my experience with music. When I was learning how to play guitar, though, She Talks to Angels was definitely one of those must learn songs that I had to learn on acoustic. And I'd forgotten how good Twice as Hard was. As soon as the album started and it kicked off with that song, I was like, oh, wait a minute. This is a good song. Jealous Again. I think I had the single of this before I bought the album. And I liked that so
Wow.
much that I went and bought the album. But, I have nothing but respect for Otis Redding, who inspired this band in many ways. I think Shake Your Moneymaker was an Otis Redding song, and that's what they named the album after. But I think their cover of Hard to Handle became the definitive version of that song, at least to our generation. If you talk to somebody about the song Hard to Handle, I would say most people from our generation are going to know the Black Crowes cover of that.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Grateful Dead fans. I'm not even going to argue with you about that. I know that was a song they played live, but it's not the same as the Black Crowes.
It's not
No,
at all.
at all. And there's a great story behind Hard to Handle. So Brendan O'Brien, the renowned producer, we forgot to mention in our producers episode. Our bad,
Bad
people.
on. Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry.
He was just starting out in the music business and he was an engineer and did some mixing on this album. They'd finished everything up, and brace yourself for, another name drop here. Producer Rick Rubin wanted to bring in Slash to play the guitar solo, most likely to probably boost the interest or visibility of the album when it came out. Hey, Slash played on this. So it would have helped sales possibly. Rich Robinson, one of the brothers in the band, the lead guitar player, he'd already left LA and flew back home because he thought he was done recording, he was done in the studio. They couldn't get hold of Slash on the phone the morning they wanted to do the recording, and they only had a little bit of time left in the studio. So Chris Robinson, the other brother, the lead singer, was still there, and he just suggested they let O'Brien play the solo, and he did.
That is a killer solo. And I'm glad Slash didn't do it. I think that could have led to some confusion with what kind of band the Black Crowes were. Some people might have bought that album based on just that little bit of knowledge, not really knowing any of the songs, and be quite surprised with what they were hearing. Ultimately, not disappointed though, because that is, and I had forgotten Rick Rubin produced this album. This album, that guitar sound he has, that tone,
Mm-hmm.
it's killer. I love his
Yeah.
guitar tone on this album.
Yeah. And I feel the same about Slash. And I know neither of us are knocking Slash when we say that.
Mm,
But that solo that O'Brien plays, it lives in a perfect space in
yes.
that song. And O'Brien played the electric organ on the song as well. He said time was running out and they were in the studio, and the other engineers were rushing him to get everything recorded quickly. I think it's really cool. I think sometimes when you're under pressure, you do your best work, and
Yes.
what they got from him in that song is amazing. Some people have tried to credit Brendan O'Brien with playing a lot more on it, and that he played all the instruments on the album, even at times. But he set the record straight a few years back. I think he was on the Rick Beato, podcast, and,
Oh,
and he
okay.
talked about it. Yeah, and he said that the band recorded that music, not himself.
Well, that's good. And put this down again. Well, every time, you know what? We need like a keyboard sound effect whenever a name like Rick Rubin is spoken that just goes, ah.
Or
Yeah,
doom.
exactly. Another huge surprise from this poll. I was sure Black Crows, yeah, that was going to be a shoe in. We combined again November, December last year, January, February. Now, based on how lacking December and January can be, th- there were a lot of good choices this time around.
Yeah, there were.
February was a little bit, it definitely, I don't know about, yeah, it was kind of stacked because it was obviously picking up January slack. And who knows, maybe other people experience fatigue as well with albums because this was one of those albums, it was kind of hard to escape. And I don't think the
Hmm.
Black Crows are really on everybody. They kind of fell into obscurity. I thought I might have killed this album for myself, but I couldn't have been more wrong. This is one of those albums that's hard not to call a 10. There's not a dud on here. It doesn't, again, right? A song by band A and a song by, or an album by band A, an album by band B, they can both be 10s, but there's ranges within that 10s. I'm not saying it's not the best album of all time. This album from beginning to end, it rocks. It's great.
Yeah, yeah. Even the filler songs sound like redneck two-step dance floor
Yeah.
classics. I think the Black Crowes get overlooked a little because they came at a time when hair metal was fading and grunge was on the rise,
Mm.
and America had had its love affair 15 years earlier with Southern rock. But if this album had been released in 1973, I think they would have overshadowed Aerosmith.
That's a bold statement because I can definitely hear some similarities there, but I get infinitely more enjoyment out of the Black Crowes than Aerosmith.
Yeah, yeah.
Southern Musical Companion, their follow up to this is one of my favorite albums.
It's amazing.
It is
Yep.
amazing. And it does prop up my feeling for, even though yeah, there may be some fatigue with Shake Your Moneymaker, but it definitely props up the Black Crowes. Great band.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, my choice, my personal choice. Surprise, everybody. Rush, Permanent Waves. We are going to talk about Rush
No,
today.
no.
Jim, you and everybody else is probably very surprised I didn't pick the Ramones. End of the century. Yes, everybody, pick your jaws up. There was a Ramones, and it was on the poll, and it had the percentage, but it did not have the number of votes. And I wanted to bring this, but I'm pretty sure everybody would have said, of course he picks a Ramones album. This, yeah, yeah, good dumbass. We know you love the Ramones. Let's move on because I've championed the Ramones a lot, and I put Rock and Roll Radio from this album on our massive playlist. And I was sure the Pretenders were not going to get in from the poll. I was wrong and very happy they got voted in. So
hmm
that was another album that hey, I went on a little bit long about that. No regrets. Love the album, but I still get a personal pick and is Rush Permanent Waves. Especially 1 week after taking a cheap shot at Prague, I'm here reviewing a Rush album. Another reason was that I may have had a Rush moment, Jim. Not gonna lie. Not a Prague moment, a Rush moment. We actually had two Rush albums to choose from, Fly By Night, and the one I chose, Permanent Vacation, or Permanent Vacation, back to Aerosmith. You put Aerosmith in my head. Fly By Night, and the one I chose, Permanent Waves.
Yeah, I have to admit, I am surprised and I am a little intrigued. So let's hear it. After all the times we have railed on Prague and perhaps been unkind to Rush, Matt, have you had a change of heart?
Yeah, I did. Not a huge one because I never hated Rush. But this moment was so strong. I listened to all of their albums up to this one. I wasn't drunk, wasn't high, just a dimly lit room and headphones, which can be a high all its own, but we can get into that later. Their biggest hits until this point were Fly By Night, Closer to the Heart, great songs, not a lot of deep tracks for my base knowledge of Rush. But when I came around to Waves, Spirit of Radio let off, and immediately I noticed the writing and the performance. It was tighter, it was cleaner, it was right to the point. Getty's singing is more subdued because when he kind of lets free, his voice is a little odd at best.
hmm
The earlier albums where he's really going for it, it's a real turnoff. As early as last year, it was a really turnoff. Man, serious. This is weird to have my opinion change on them so much. We'll see where I am in a few months, but I'm enjoying this new feeling.
Yeah, you're not alone. To be honest, I enjoyed this album a lot. I walked away with it with the impression that Spirit of Radio has to be one of the best written rock compositions.
Yeah.
Call it prog, but there is a straightforward, three chord rock song right in the middle of it with badass grooves, and then there's a little flip over to reggae at the end, which is really cool. And when it's one of those songs, once again from Rush, where you can't help but air drum to Neil Peart and everything he's doing.
Yeah, that he is a drum god, man. And his drums, and this was another thing I noticed, his drums take on a different sound on this album. He used a new kit for this record, and it sounds like he really focused on the tuning and setting them up better to be separate in the mix. Because prior to
hmm
this, they could sit in a little bit too much, a little too muddy. This to me is the Neil Peart sound I hear in my head when someone says Rush. It's very, very, very clear, his drums, especially his toms. There's great separation here, and you can hear them start in one ear and end in the other. And that's a
Yep, yep.
fantastic feeling. I've always been a more casual listener of Rush and usually hit skip. I hate to say it. when they come on, but Spirit of Radio, Free Will, they have taken on a fresh life for me. After the hits,
Mhm.
I still enjoy this album immensely. Hands down, this was a really great album. And I had always wondered if Alex Lifeson was, ooh, I hate to say this, overrated.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. Because but it's me. It's my focus. It's always been on Getty and Neil. And Alex kind of sinks into the background until he doesn't need to. And that's kind of the genius of what he does. Because when you actually, me personally, when I finally notice what he's doing, I'm like, holy shit, this guy is freaking incredible.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jacob's Ladder gave him more of the spotlight. About a minute and a half into the song, he starts soloing, and it reminds me of Black Sabbath, and he's real bluesy at the end of different strings. I got a definite, not only a new appreciation for Rush, but for Alex Lifeson in particular.
Well, I'll just take this right back to the start of the show in Primus, and we talk about Larry Lamont and his guitar playing. And I think when
Yeah,
you
you're
talk about
right.
Alex Lifeson, these guys that are surrounded by, such great other players, I'm sure filling in those spaces and those parts are really difficult. But he shows, and really on this album, listening to it, that he has this desire to have his own sound. And I even messaged you, this week. I was like, well, there's a lot of chorus on that guitar, but that's cool.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different than what everybody else was doing, and it fills a ton of space for a trio. It really works. And come on, when you're listening to this, Geddy Lee is a master of bass. I
Hands
mean,
down,
I,
man.
I cannot believe he can
Dude is
play
awesome.
and sing some of those lines at the same
Yeah, yeah,
time.
it is just like Primus. I linked those two bands at the beginning of the show because they
Yeah, yeah.
really are similar in that the rhythm section, I mean, I don't even know if you can call it a rhythm section with Primus, but the bass and the drum kind of like take more of the spotlight. And then when you finally focus on what the guitarist is doing, you're like, oh,
That's
damn, that
crazy.
guy's awesome.
Yeah.
Holy crap. And I completely agree with you with chorus on guitar. That has been a big challenge for me. I sometimes have to turn off the police because it gets to be too much. And hair metal, the guitarists, oh man, especially in the
Yeah,
later
they
mid
can turn it
80s, they
on.
turn it
Yeah.
on and it was like,
Yep.
oh man, it kind of loses the edge a little bit.
Hmm.
But with the three piece where you need to fill out a little more space, or maybe it's just better use of it by Alex Lifeson. I don't know. It's a part-time annoyance. Time's got to be right. The big challenge though with this record, I thought was going to be the last song, Natural Science. 9 minutes, it's not a long time in general, but for its song, and when I see it coming up and it's got a main title and it's got, subtitles underneath it, like 5 6 deep, I'm like, oh shit, what am I in for? but I loved it.
Well, hey, it's still Rush. It's still Rush, man. Okay, so there we go. Those are our albums. There are still some albums we need to talk about from the end of the show. Matt, I'm certain there's some metal from this period of time you want to bring
Well,
up.
there is 1985, uh, Thunder in the East from Loudness, great Japanese hair metal band. The Firm, Jimmy Page, come on. We just talked about Led
Yeah,
Zeppelin, King Cobra, Ready to Strike, Anthrax, Armed and Dangerous, love it. Slaughter, Stick It to You. David Lee
nice.
Roth, Crazy from the Heat EP. There was Van Halen, Balance. I'm feel like I'm pressing here. Damn Yankees, Damn Yankees
Oh,
debut.
yeah, there
There
you
is
go.
some
There you go.
great
There you
hair
go.
metal going on here.
I'm just going to talk about a couple of other albums. We had Jewel Pieces of You that had a few votes from the poll. It's worth mentioning. It's not a bad album at all. There's nothing bad to say about it. It was refreshing in its day. We both love There Might Be Giants Flood. This album was proof to me that you could have a sense of humor making music and not have to be Weird Al. It's playful, delightful, musically fun. Your racist friend might be very poignant and worth a revisit in today's political
I can't
climate.
recommend this album enough. Listen to Flood.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. And then we also had a Jim Jam album, MC Hammer's Please Don't Hurt 'Em. This album did not hold up over time, but it contributed one good thing to society. You Can't Touch This still gets people up on the dance floor and dancing like fools at weddings
Yeah,
to this
it's
very
still
day.
it's a novelty hit
It
now.
does. Run DMC, Kings of Rock,
Oh
more
God.
Rick Rubin. Yeah, and this album was what crossed rap and hip hop into white living rooms in America because of the Walk This Way collaboration with Aerosmith. And My Adidas is classic. And then you have the Smiths, Meat is Murder. You Have My Sympathies because you told me you listened to the album this
Yeah,
week.
it's
And
horrible.
I
Sorry.
think we both struggle with Morrissey's voice.
Yes.
I also think the lyrics are aimed at 15-year-olds who feel like no one's ever going to love them. I've never been a Smiths fan, and I don't foresee this changing in the
Ever,
future.
never.
There was, let me say, The Cure, Boys Don't Cry. This was a
I was
compilation of
gonna say that's
singles
not
that came
fair.
out, but they hadn't released a full album yet. So kind of it was an album. And Boys Don't Cry was a new song, and it's been cherished by fans ever
Stop
since.
crying, Jim.
You didn't bring up Alice Cooper, which is more glam
Oh, true.
metal,
I
but
forget.
yeah, he would have fit in there. Welcome to My Nightmare. That's a classic album from 1975. And also from 1975, Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. And I was surprised this album didn't get more votes. I know we've both struggled with Dylan, but I personally, I like this album. This is probably something I can listen to a little bit more. Shelter from the Storm is one of my favorite Dylan songs. And even though I'm not a Dylan guy, Tangled Up in Blue is a song I respect from a songwriting standpoint.
Yeah, people
So,
still just love hating on Dylan. That's all that comes
yeah,
down to.
there are artists there are always going to be love hate relationships with, and he's going to be one of those guys.
Yep,
But
exactly.
that does wrap up pretty much everything for the January, February album anniversary
Yeah, I
episode.
like it. I feel good. I feel like we gotten everything out that we needed to. And we want to thank
We do.
everybody for tuning in. Hey, thank you.
We do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We know your time is important and there's a lot of ways you could be spending your time, but thank you for spending it with us.
And coming up next, you are going to see us
No.
for our 100th episode. We are going to go back to genres. We are going to do new wave, and we are going to do this on video and have it on YouTube. And I don't know where else it'll show up. That's probably YouTube.
Yeah.
And that's about it. But if you actually want to see
Sorry in
what we look
advance.
like, yes, we are going to do the show for you straight up so that it is not just a recorded episode on Spotify or wherever else you might listen to it. But we know nobody's listening to it on YouTube. We've seen those
Exactly,
numbers.
We've seen the numbers.
So we're gonna go put some video up there, and it's gonna be a lot of fun for us, and we're gonna have a good time. And it's probably gonna be a little different than the past 99 shows, and this one included.
Yeah, we're gonna try to be a little more concise, right?
We are maybe a little more sober. Who knows?
Oh.
No promises.
My liver thanks you.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. As Matt said, this is the Jam Yearbook. We are very happy to have you here. Look us up on Facebook. We have the Facebook public page. We have the Facebook private page where you can vote on our polls. And we are looking forward to seeing you next for our 100th episode. Matt, say goodbye to everybody.
Bye, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Peace, love, and podcast.
Lost in